If this were anyone other than the New York Times, they would have been permanently banned from social media for having made such an egregious series of errors. What's up?
Oh, hi. I'm going into Home Depot.
All right, we need a new washer and dryer because they stopped working.
I'm gonna get you a dryer for your birthday, okay?
And it's Winston's birthday. Hi! Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and this is Winnie the Westie, who turns 1-year-old today, and I'm just gonna flash a couple of pictures of Winston at 2 weeks old because it is the cutest thing on earth, and if I've learned one thing from the internet, cute puppy pictures get your thumbs up. Today we are talking about a New York Times article that made so many mistakes in the article that if anyone else had published an article with such misinformation in it, they would be permanently banned from social media altogether. It wasn't just one mistake, it wasn't just two mistakes, it was a series of mistakes that overstated child hospitalizations resulting from COVID by, just a small amount of
800,000.
And that wasn't even the only mistake in the article. It was a series of mistakes that is unforgivable. It is unforgivable for anyone, let alone the New York Times. And in an era where YouTube is quite literally taking down channels for publishing misinformation, and where Google says it's no longer going to advertise on channels and pages that promote climate denial, this mistake is all the more egregious, and the fact that nothing is going to happen to the New York Times is telling of the Times. From futurity.org, can YouTube's vaccine misinformation ban work? Quote, I think that this policy is going in the right direction, end quote, says Giuliana Stringini. Quote, there is a fine line to be walked between dangerous misinformation and free speech, end quote. Dangerous misinformation, just let those words sink in as we read another article, this one from the New York Times. Google bans ads on content, including YouTube videos, with false claims about climate change. And getting to the article that is going to be the heart of this vlog, from Fox News. New York Times issues massive correction after overstating COVID hospitalizations among children. Paper added over 800,000 to total of kids hospitalized with coronavirus. You know what? We're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we get into this most recent massive error committed by the New York Times, I've got to go back to one story that I will never forgive the New York Times for, partially because they have never actually apologized and properly corrected their mistake, but when they reported on the death of Officer Brian Sicknick from the January 6th riots, they have never corrected their misinformation that they provided to millions and millions of people. From the New York Post, opinion. Will the Times apologize for lying about Officer Sicknick's death? And as I refresh the memories of some and inform others who may not be aware of the egregious misinformation the New York Times put out after January 6th as relates to the death of Officer Brian Sicknick, dangerous misinformation. Let those words echo around your head as we read this. An unruly crowd entered the U.S. Capitol on Jan 6 while then President Donald Trump addressed a rally several blocks away. One member of that crowd, Ashley Babbitt, an unarmed woman and a veteran, was shot by the Capitol Police. The next day, Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick died in the hospital. On Jan 8, the New York Times reported that Officer Sicknick had died after being struck in the head with a fire extinguisher by violent Trump supporters. This story was quickly repeated by numerous other media outlets. Millions believed it. The story was false. Dangerous misinformation being put out by the New York Times that turns out to be outright false, and it wasn't just outright false. The New York Times knew or ought to have known that it was outright false. Sicknick died of 2 strokes which occurred many hours after the invasion of the Capitol. The blue check media fallback was that bear spray used by the Capitol invaders had caused the officer's strokes. That also turned out to be false. After a curiously long day, the D.C. Medical Examiner's Office released its report this week, and it concludes that Sicknick suffered no injuries, internal or external. He didn't have a reaction to bear spray, the chief medical examiner reported. So the single most important, quote, fact, end quote, about the events of Jan 6 was false. That leaves some questions. That leaves some pretty obvious questions like who are the sources, what was the vetting of those sources, what was done to confirm the information being provided by these anonymous sources. Oddly enough, it raises the same questions that are going to come up in the context of today's misinformation.
How does this happen at the Old Gray Lady?
Actually, I'm not sure if they referred to the New York Times as the Old Gray Lady or just the Gray Lady, and I'm mixing it up with the old gray mare. She ain't what she used to be, but either way, how does this happen?
Old gray mare, she ain't what she used to be. Ain't what she used to be. Ain't what she used to be.
Will the Times apologize for its error? It could have independently confirmed its claims by checking with Sicknick's family or with the hospital. Or the paper could simply have waited until it had definitive confirmation of the facts and refrained from reporting a falsehood in the meanwhile. As leftist journalist Glenn Greenwald notes, the Times didn't check the facts because the paper needed the story to be true. It was essential to the narrative its editors had settled upon, namely that Trump and his supporters were, quote, insurrectionists, end quote, posing a violent threat to democracy. Says Greenwald, quote, the gruesome story of Sicknick's murder was too valuable to allow any questioning. Because if Sicknick weren't murdered by them, then nobody was. Without Sicknick, the only ones killed were 4 pro-Trump supporters. 2 who died of a heart attack, 1 from an amphetamine overdose, and the other, Ashley Babbitt, who was shot point blank in the neck by Capitol Police despite being unarmed, end quote. And as I go over the next highlights, just apply everything that is being said here, mutatis mutandis, to the article that we're going to cover after this story. And the storyline is always designed to help liberals and hurt conservatives and to cast GOP politicians and their supporters in a bad light. Some of this is because the vast majority of people working in newsrooms are now Democrats and virulently partisan Democrats at that. Some of it is because many outlets, the Times most definitely included, cater to the partisan leanings of their subscribers who are far from representative of national opinion as a whole. So the outlets tell them what they want to hear, such as the bogus but undying notion that Team Trump, quote, colluded, end quote, with Russia. And some of it is simply because they can. There will be no significant consequences to the Times for spreading a lie that divided and inflamed the country at a dangerous time. For all the moralizing about people, quote, spreading misinformation, end quote, on social media, the biggest spreaders of misinformation in America are the liberal media, the Times above all. This article is from April 22nd, 2021, but it could have been written this morning about this article because everything in here applies mutatis mutandis. And for those of you who don't know what mutatis mutandis means, it means making the appropriate changes to fit it to the circumstances. New York Times issues massive correction after overstating COVID hospitalizations among children. The New York Times issued a massive correction Thursday after the liberal newspaper severely misreported the number of COVID hospitalities among children in the United States by more than 800,000. Now, I'm fairly certain that Fox News meant to use the term hospitalizations here and not hospitalities, and there is a big difference between typo and misinformation, and I'm not saying that Fox News is innocent of ever providing misinformation, but today we are talking about the Times. A report headlined, quote, a new vaccine strategy for children, just 1 dose for now, end quote, by science and health reporter Apurva Mandavili was peppered with errors before major changes were made to the story. The Times initially reported, quote, nearly 900,000 children have been hospitalized, end quote, with COVID since the pandemic began, when the factual data in the now corrected version is that, quote, more than 63,000 children were hospitalized with COVID-19 from August 2020 to October 2021, end quote. Now, there are people who even today say that that number is still overstated because on the one hand, it probably includes kids who are hospitalized not necessarily because of COVID, but with COVID, and also while referring to them as children, that number probably includes a large number of people 15 to 19 years old. But there is a big difference between that number and how it might be overstated depending on how they do the count versus overstating that number by 800,000 kids. And if that were the only error in the article that needed correction, it would be bad enough, but it is by no means the only error in that article. And just wait until you read the correction the Times issued. Quote, an earlier version of this article incorrectly described actions taken by regulators in Sweden and Denmark. They have halted use of the Moderna vaccine in children. They have not begun offering single doses. The article also misstated the number of COVID hospitalizations in U.S. children. It is more than 63,000 from August 2020 to October 2021, not 900,000 since the beginning of the pandemic. In addition, the article misstated the timing of an FDA meeting on authorization of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine for children. It is later this month, not next week. If this were a high school essay, it would get a big fat F and the kid would get a stern warning from their professor to double check their facts
before submitting work.
But this is not high school, this is the New York Times, and this article, before publication, presumably went through a number of checks and balances to make sure that the information was accurate and that it passes basic quality control. But alas, it gets published bungled with errors, meaningful and severe misinformation, but wait until you see what was subtly included at the end of this correction. Apurva Mandavili is a reporter focusing on science and global health. She is the 2019 winner of the Victor Cohn Prize for Excellence in Medical Science Reporting. There is one reason and one reason only why you would include someone's credentials in a correction, and that is to attenuate, to sort of dull the blow of the correction, and I think this lighting. There you go, that's better. Now you don't see that glare. They include the credentials of the journalist in the correction only to reiterate or try to reconfirm that this journalist is in fact a professional with credentials, although now it will cause a lot of people to question the validity of that award that she was given. And how do other journalists respond to this journalism? Journalist Gerald Beer asked, quote, how did an error that large happen at New York Times, end quote. Columnist Phil Kerpen sarcastically said the Times reporter was, quote, meeting her usual standards, end quote, with the inaccurate report. Quote, NYT had an outstanding, highly experienced COVID reporter, but was fired because he made very rich teenagers unhappy when forced to entertain them on a paid trip, end quote. He wrote, referring to Donald McNeil Jr., who was forced to step down earlier this year. Quote, now we have an incompetent in his place constantly doing this or saying it's racist to investigate COVID origins, end quote. Greenwald added, referring to when Mandeville said the coronavirus, quote, lab leak, end quote, theory had, quote, racist roots, end quote. And then, because the internet is oftentimes a very cruel yet oftentimes hilarious place, you do have people poking fun at the award that this journalist received. Many observers also mocked the paper for printing that Mandeville, quote, is the 2019 winner of the Victor Cohn Prize for Excellence in Medical Science Reporting, end quote, directly below the correction. Rutgers University professor Richard H. Ebright feels the prize is, quote, awarded to the dimmest candles on the science stenographer cake, end quote. Quote, basically it has devolved to being an award for diligence in groupthink and virtue signaling, end quote, he added. The ultimate irony, and this goes back to the first article that we read, is that had this been any other platform on social media, they would be banned for having published misinformation as relates to COVID. But this is the New York Times, so all they have to do is issue a correction that is going to be read by a fraction of the number of the people who read the original article, with the lasting impression that having read that article is going to leave in their brains and psyches. This is the New York Times, the institution that makes the rules so they can break the rules with impunity, whereas had it been anyone else, they would have been literally blacklisted from social media altogether. But this is not just one failure in one article, this is a systematic failure in one article in the broader context of systematic failures
From the New York Times itself.
And for an institution that runs around screaming misinformation, looking to punish and silence the voices of those who publish misinformation, they are the greatest purveyors of misinformation out there. And even more dangerous than being purveyors of misinformation, they do it under the cloak of legitimate journalism, and it is about time for everyone to tune out and shut off the New York Times. Now, with that said, if you like my videos, you like my content, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment in the comment section below because it feeds the algorithm. If you want to support the channel, all of the support links are in the pinned comment. Robert Barnes and I do weekly streams every Sunday. We do weekly streams with a guest every Wednesday called The Sidebar. If you want to find us and support us on Locals, where supporters get lots of exclusive content, you can find us at...
Oh, man, one of these days I'll get this right. There we go. VivaBarnesLaw.locals.com.
All of my content is also on Rumble, but more important than any of that, take care of yourselves, check in on friends and family, make sure everyone around you is doing well, and now you know your vlog. Peace out.